Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing nonprofit, educational, or personal use, tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay, guys, this is from the book Human Trafficking by the U.S. Church of Scientology by Stephen Douglas. This is page 28. It's a little old, but the information is still accurate. Religion-sponsored white slavery, a new form of human trafficking. On October 19, 1995, an article appeared in the Tampa Tribune, Florida, USA, that reported a case of coerced slavery of a young Mexican woman who was offered free classes if she joined a local church. Instead, she was put to work remodeling the former Clearwater Bank building into church offices. Reportedly, she worked from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. each day at the church's headquarters in Clearwater, Florida. She was never given her free classes up until the time she was able to escape her captors. The church in question was the Church of Scientology. This story about Miss Perez is one of the many stories about victims of the Church of Scientology, but this story and many others until now are not considered as human trafficking or modern white slavery. Quoting an April 8, 1993 article in Far Eastern Economic Review, the author noted that the U.S. would remain vulnerable to human trafficking unless it is stopped. You guys think there's a reason that it just keeps going on? Think about that. Unless it is stopped at the sending gate. In August 1998, the U.S. government made such a decision by stopping the issuance of R1 religious worker visas to members of the Church of Scientology. Imagine that, you guys. Located throughout Eastern Europe and countries of the former Soviet Union. It is my belief that this decision was the result of an April 1998 interview given to the head of the visa section of the U.S. consulate in St. Petersburg, Russia, by a Russian Scientologist that had recently returned from visiting the Church of Scientology in Clearwater, Florida, the same church visited by Miss Perez in 1995. She was in prison there. She wasn't visiting. During my recent travels to St. Petersburg, my interviews included attempts to gain insight into the religious white slavery trade, and particularly regarding the Church of Scientology. My interviewees had little or no knowledge on this subject, other than what they had read in the Moscow Times and St. Petersburg Times newspapers. None of these articles included information on members of the Church of Scientology. Shocking. Traveling to the USA. Of the interviews previously noted in Part 1, I did have the opportunity to discuss the Church of Scientology with the cultural attaché of the U.S. Department of State. Mr. Fficking was personally aware that the Church of Scientology offices in St. Petersburg invited Russians to travel abroad, and personally knew of one individual who had been invited to Crimea in the mid-90s. The trip was organized for non-Scientologists to visit a Scientology center to learn about the church. The woman who went to the Crimea did not join the church and returned to Russia, According to Mr. Scientology, her reasons for going were an excuse to visit the Crimea. I discussed details of my 2 case studies to be presented in this section, and he said he intended to contact Chris Miscagno, the current visa consul in the U.S. consulate in St. Petersburg, to learn more about the issue. U.S. government, unknowing sponsor of religious white slavery, I believe they know. The U.S. government repeatedly approved the issuance of R1 visa workers visas, or R2 for children under 21, or R2 for children under 21. The unknowing Russian Scientologists in the mid to late 90s. In the case of the Russians who went to the Church of Scientology, the U.S. government made possible a transnational crime that would inevitably take place each time one of the unknowing victims would arrive at the Clearwater Church. I will discuss the legal ramifications of the R1 and R2 religious visas issued by the U.S. government and focus on the relative issues concerning slavery and human trafficking used by the Church of Scientology. The most important fact is that the religious workers that have visited the Church of Scientology have been used as janitors and for other menial labor positions, a clear violation of their R1 visas. Notice they're not talking about the R2 visas, right? Surprise. R1 religious worker visas. The R1 classification applies to a religious worker. This refers to an alien coming to the U.S. temporarily to work as a minister of religion, as a professional in a religious vocation or occupation. Yeah, of a church, right? You guys notice that? Or for a bona fide nonprofit religious organization, and at the request of the organization in a religious occupation, which relates to a traditional religious function. Dependent spouses and unmarried children under 21 years of age of R1 workers are entitled to R2 status with the same restrictions and privileges as the principal. Interesting. According to the description of religious occupation, as prescribed by the U.S. Department of Justice, both the R1 and R2 visas do not include janitors, maintenance workers, clerks, fundraisers, and solicitors of donations of similar occupations.